Morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining EGroup's summer webinar series. Today, we will be discussing how to determine your Azure SQL options and get there fast using the Database Migration Assistant tool. So joining us today is our speaker, Matt Ronchetto. Matt has served in several IT leadership roles, leading large organizations through the change management process and driving technical change. Now, as a cloud architect for EGroup, Matt is working with organizations to help define their hybrid cloud strategy and build and execute on a technology roadmap that works for them. For those of you joining us for the first time, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask them in the chat box, as we'll be answering any and all questions at the end of the webinar. So with that being said, take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Carly. Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is our fourth session of our summer webinar series. There's a lot of good ones, good content about Microsoft incentive programs, things like that, technical deeper dives. So if you're interested in those, we can certainly send you links to the previous ones. Today, we're going to be talking about the options that you have for leveraging Microsoft Public Cloud for some of the major use cases around SQL Server. So let's get in here. So again, the webinar goals, we're looking to educate and demystify the most relevant options for Azure-based SQL. Again, there's a lot of stuff out there. The marketplace is moving very quickly, but we're going to touch on the key topics today. Demo the Database Migration Assistant tool. So if you haven't seen that DMA tool, it's come a long way. There's actually a sneak peek on something that was released just in the last week. But Microsoft is enhancing that and obviously is incentivized by trying to get you moving and reducing that friction of migration for your organizations. We're going to discuss some of the key gotchas. So again, Database Migration Tool is a very powerful tool, but there's still some things you guys will need to be aware of as you're moving from SQL Server on-prem to Azure. And then kind of the empower you to act in your environment. Kind of what are those next immediate steps that you can be doing to move the needle. So first off, just a little bit about EGroup. We've founded in 1999, 2 decades, kind of grew up in the data center space and are now firmly entrenched in managed service and kind of cloud services. So, you know, for many organizations that are doing that same progression, we've kind of lived that, and our skill set has changed over the years. You can see some of the kind of greatest hits. We're privately owned, debt-free. We're national and international as far as our reach. Over 500 customers kind of on the East Coast. We're primarily in that East Coast space, but we do have projects going on really internationally. And then just some of the recent recognition. Ingram Micro is one of the bigger cloud kind of Azure partners, and we were their partner of the year. You can see some of the other ones just as far as, you know, speaks to our technical solutions and some of our growth. So I was interested to see that SQL Server turns the big 3.0 this year, released in 1989. And really, as I talk about some of the cloud solutions, I wanted to start with kind of where SQL Server was. Don't know exactly where, you know, any of your careers have jumped in. I've seen some of this progression, but, you know, the very early versions of SQL Server were kind of how you expected the 90s and software to be. There was a version every couple of years, maybe a service pack between versions, but very, very cumbersome to do those upgrades. Around the mid-2000s, they switched to a year-based cadence, but still every couple of years it took to roll out. They finally began to embrace virtualization, and we've seen that firmly entrenched now. But again, you know, if you're running something like a SQL 2005, 2008 R2, there's a reason for that, right? It's 2019, but those machines kind of are almost stamped in place. Upgrades are scary. To run high availability in SQL is pretty complex. Support is expensive, and that creates significant barriers to entry and to change. So I wanted to start there and talk about how the cloud mindset has changed that. So, you go from Doogie to Neil, now our senior DBA, right? And, at EGroup, we talk about cloud as an operational model. You'll see the joke, the tagline, cloud's just another guy's data center. We kind of disagree to a point, or at least you shouldn't be thinking of it that way. Cloud is all about standards, simple, scalable. To do that, you need to have configuration versus customization, not a lot of special snowflakes. It's going to be software versus hardware based, so it's not going to be very proprietary hardware. That's going to be kind of widgets, and that software is going to be overlaying any of those widgets, and then very open to integrations. And so this really democratizes IT, but it also sets expectations, kind of that consumerism mentality. I want to just go out there, I want to hit download, I want it to run. So the demanding speed of that to market, to scale your resources up and down, and honestly to failure. You want to be able to try something out in dev test, either it works or it doesn't, throw it away and kind of move on. And so if you get on that public cloud model, you're able to leverage vendors as your innovation engine. And again, we'll talk about DMA tools, but instead of trying to do a migration yourself, you're able to leverage a tool like that is getting enhanced by Microsoft. And then SQL Server itself, if you're using and consuming things as a service, you're now on that innovation train, and you can kind of see the progression versus trying to kind of roll your own. And so what that gets you is that changes are now relatively safe and relatively unseen. And I kind of say that because SQL, is your crown jewels. It is complex. Many other services, I would say, 100% safe. These things are happening in the background. SQL is an area where, that complexity can still show itself. So again, what that gets you is kind of this cloud service journey. And most organizations, I would say all, start on the left and have been progressing somewhere to the right. In the Microsoft space, IaaS would be, infrastructure as a service, and that's kind of the Windows Azure platform, right? There are also platform as a service, or PaaS services, that you can consume all the way up to SaaS services. So if you look at an Office 365 versus running Exchange online or on-prem, or Windows Intune versus an SCCM, that's really, if your organizations are moving all the way over there, you just want to consume a service, you want to get a login and pay a subscription fee. And so as you think about this, you're probably in different areas of this graph for different applications, but that progression has been kind of happening over time. And so where that really gets you in that cloud space around databases, so this is just the Azure Marketplace. I did a quick search for databases, and you get a whole host of options. And all of these are available at a button press. If you click on any of these things, you're going to templatize that deployment. It's going to spin up, and you can start to play around with that. If you don't like it, you can spin it down. You're only going to be charged for what you need. So what you get is, instead of the long lead times for hardware, for installation, you now have cloud transformation really accelerating your ability to try some of these things out, move forward with them, standardize them, templatize them, and kind of scale up. So digging into that overview of, just how cloud has transformed the space just with that speed, let's take a look at some of the Azure options specifically for SQL. So again, when we talk about, cloud's just another guy's data center, if you're going in the IaaS route, to a certain extent, that's true. You are just running a server in a Microsoft data center. Now, you get a lot of goodness, and that's kind of what I outlined here on the slide, but you're still going to own a lot of that stack. So taking the IaaS versus PaaS story, you're going to be a little more on the left of that graph. But things you do get are, you can move to an OpEx versus CapEx, operational versus CapEx model. So you're not having to buy on these 5-year or longer life cycles. You can spin up and spin down. When you move to Azure, you still have the ability to use the hybrid benefit. Another thing that kind of goes into that is reserved instances. So you can buy ahead or you can bring your own license to reduce costs, but somebody is taking care of the hardware, and that somebody in the Azure world is Microsoft. So you're getting their level of standardization and support at the hardware level. And so that gives you kind of cloud speed to implement anything. You press a button, it spins up. You don't have to worry about long lead times for hardware. So in this model, you kind of have full control. Once you log into that machine, it would really look and feel like a machine in your virtual environment in your data center today. You get your choice of SQL Server version. If you want to uninstall, reinstall, upgrade, you can change your VM sizes and disk configurations. All those things are available with really little to no constraints. The flip side to that is you own everything above the hardware stack. So you're in charge of OS and SQL patching. If you wanted to do HA, high availability, you need to do that. You need to be aware of your backups and your DR plan. So again, if you want that infinite scale and that speed, this is a great solution. If you don't want to do any refactoring of your code, you literally could move and spin up the exact same implementation you have today and move that stuff over. But you don't get much else. And so we want to start to talk then about some of the additional options. And a big one in the SQL space is platform as a service, or PaaS. So what this provides is, and we kind of talk about the deployment options at the bottom, but all of these deployment options would provide kind of the bullets I've laid out here. You're on the latest stable version of SQL. Microsoft is taking care of that, and again, upgrades are really kind of hidden from you. Hybrid benefit, bring your own license, is still available, as are reserved instances, so you can still buy ahead, but Microsoft's taking care of that. You have built-in high availability and backups. So there are, for the different deployment options, you do have some retention and backup options, but the high availability is taken care of. And honestly, Microsoft needs to do this because as they're doing server patches or SQL patches, all of that is hidden from you. And that means increased uptime. So if you're running one SQL server that is kind of a special snowflake, and every time you need to do a patch, you're taking down one or all of your databases or customers, again, in this high availability, that's abstracted from you. You don't have to worry about that. But now that they have two servers running in HA mode, they can now patch these servers without downtime. So really nice. But again, Microsoft owns much more of that stack. And with that ability to hand that off to Microsoft, you're now into more of a configuration versus customization. So you're not going to have as many options. And we'll kind of lay out what those options are and aren't as we get now into the deployment options of PaaS. So first one we'll talk about is just a single database deployment. So probably the easiest and most straightforward, highly available database, still got the backups and the retention policies with its own set of resources. And those resources can be laid out vCore based, so 1 to 80 vCores. And those, essentially there's a Gen 4 and a Gen 5. Think of that as a hardware upgrade that Microsoft has gone through. So you've got some levers that you can pull here, but the standard RAM ratios for Gen 4 and Gen 5 are kind of immutable. So if you pick Gen 4, you're going to get a 1 to 7 core to RAM ratio. If you pick Gen 5, you're going to get 1 to 5. Kind of that's it. Gen 5 does have accelerated networking, which is a pretty deep topic, but if you're having heavy I/O workloads, especially outside of the server to kind of an app layer, might be worth looking into. That's a quote unquote free feature that you actually can turn on your VMs at certain sizes that we're seeing more and more folks asking about and implementing for high IOP workloads. In addition to vCore, which I think is the most kind of understood, we have this new concept of DTU that in the SQL world. And we'll talk a little bit, kind of put in the bottom, what the heck is a DTU? But essentially, think of it as funny money, kind of casino chips. You have between 5,000 and 4,000 DTU that you can apply. That essentially is capacity. And then again, you've got backup, storage tier, and retention options. So you can move that data off-site, and then you can retain at different intervals. So the second one, kind of an offshoot of the single deployment, is Elastic Pool. And essentially what this does is it's a multi-tenant approach to capacity, not to number of databases. So if you think about that, if I've got 3 small databases, maybe I want to provide the capacity over all 3 of those because they're going to burst at different times. So I provide myself a little bit of elasticity, to use their verb, but I'm paying the same price for that. And this can happen in a core-based or a DTU-based fashion. Essentially, you apply that capacity across 1 or more databases, and it'll get applied as needed up to the amount that you've allotted. So the rule of thumb here is just to look at this for kind of 3 or more databases. There's no real reason to have Elastic Pool. It costs a little bit more for a database because you're not really getting that flexibility and variability. But you still have the same areas here, similar choices, vCore, DTU-based, backup, storage tier. Do I want to replicate off-site? How long do I retain my backups? The Gen 4, Gen 5. We'll talk a little bit about this, and would love to hear any questions you guys have that are specific to those. And then again, I bring up the service tier options because you have the ability to do kind of general or business critical, and there's a couple things that again come with that. So increased price tier, but you're going to get a higher SLA and at times a little bit more performance or feature functionality. And then for these 2, so these were kind of the pure PaaS solutions, and what Microsoft introduced maybe 18 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, is this thought of a managed instance. And so for folks that couldn't refactor their code and couldn't get to a PaaS kind of product, managed instance is supposed to kind of bridge that gap. It's a new option touting, and kind of this is their quote, near 100% compatibility with on-prem. But again, it's still PaaS. And so you're still bound by the configuration versus customization design. And where Microsoft has made a decision to go a certain route in managed instance, you're going to be blocked by that. You're not going to be able to fully customize. So if you're looking to manage that instance, you by yourself, that would be the IaaS version versus managed instance of PaaS. And so we recommend the kind of database migration assistant for fast assessment. And typically it's a lack of other services. Managed instance does solve some of these, but I'll show it here on the assessment. In the one we run today, things like I can't just run PowerShell on my machine are blocked. And so anywhere where you're maybe calling that, you're going to need to make a change there. Within SSIS, sometimes you might be able to run that, but there might be calls or code within that that's just not going to be able to run in there. So again, similar choices. The vCore lowest level is a bit higher. Again, that kind of covers Microsoft. They want at least a certain base price. And then some of the backup storage tier and retention options based, again, on those service tier options are a little bit different. And so they are doing a lot of this kind of area. And with managed instance, they will guarantee essentially that they're taking the backup and replicating and doing things of that nature. So for that extra cost, you do have a little bit of movement, but essentially Microsoft wants to lock you into a design that they feel like they can stand behind. So those are kind of the deployment options of PaaS. Again, we would be saying if you can refactor, if you were building net new, looking in that pure PaaS model makes sense. If you're running SQL, as many organizations are, doing an assessment at that managed instance level to get a lot of the goodness and to get Microsoft kind of taking care of that is kind of worth your time. And again, what Microsoft is putting on top of that managed instance is some tuning, kind of DBA light, we call it, so that you can maybe get out of that. So they take care of the hardware, they certainly take care of kind of the OS and the SQL version, and they're providing light DBA services while still giving you that near 100% compatibility. So looping back to what is a DTU and kind of why do I care? DTU stands for Database Throughput Unit, and kind of roughly it's a blend of CPU, memory, and I/O that simulates real world. And again, I put those quotes in this time. I don't know what real world is, and it might be different for you than for me. And so calculators exist, but it's still more art than science. And there are deep, long form articles available on, where the DTU area makes sense and where it doesn't, and what that really amounts to. But the rule of thumb is based on service tier, 100 to 125 DTU equal one core. And so a couple areas where you see it in use and not in use. If you're looking to just run something very small, again, the smallest vCore machine, if you're just kind of testing or messing around with it, is $185 a month versus the smallest standard, and you can even get a basic that's smaller than this, but standard's kind of the level I would say that enterprises might be looking at is $15 a month. So much smaller. So if you're running something that doesn't need a vCore, makes a lot of sense. And again, you can lump those together to also leverage DTU if you have many machines that all use under one vCore. Where it doesn't make sense, or where you quickly see it kind of, I haven't seen many large organizations or organizations using bigger SQL that you very quickly in the DTU model get up into some fairly high sizes, premium, and you'll see different ways that they rank DTU. And at that point, I see organizations just saying, hey, I'd like to take kind of the nuance out of this, and if I have this many cores, let's just try to recreate that in Azure with the same vCores. And then what we always ask in cloud is, because of that speed, let's get that out there, let's see how the real world works, and then tune up or down, and that is very quick, especially in the PaaS world. That would be opaque to your customers. So the other thing I put in this, just so that you guys are aware of it, if you're looking at all these options, if it's just kind of like, wow, that was a lot to digest very quickly, do a search for Azure Pricing Calculator. You'll get this link. Really great resource if you're looking for, hey, how do I see how much this versus that is? And what you're going to see in there is the different drop downs. Region may change your price a little bit. Obviously, type, managed instance, elastic pool is going to a lot. Backup storage tier, again, this is locally redundant storage, but you can have geolocated storage. Service tier we talked about, generation, and the instances that are available. And then I really, for organizations that kind of understand those concepts, about a VM, really want to stress reserved instance and hybrid benefit things below. So again, if you committed to this particular configuration for a year, you would save 21% of the list price. And if you had your SA software availability, and you could bring your own license, you can save up to 55%. That it's saying right there by bringing your own license. So some pretty significant savings, and would definitely want to call those out. You might be looking at list price, but understand there's some options to pull those prices down pretty dramatically. All right. So flipping over to the database migration assistant, what is it, and kind of what does it do? So it really does two things. We'll dig into a demo here in a little bit, but it does two things. It assesses, and it can actually do the migration for you. So it's a quick download that you can pull down, and if you have credentials to your SQL Server environment, it'll be pretty non-impactful assessment. Again, I would use it at your off-hour times, but for the most part, it's just doing reads, it's pulling the schema, it's trying to see kind of where these things stand. A little bit of overhead, but not much. So literally, you just are giving it source and at time target and credentials, and it can do those assessments. So what we mean by that is, if you have a 2008 R2, you'd point the source and it would determine what that is. Target would be what you may aspire to get to. And so at times, if you say, I want to go SQL Server, not Azure, it'll actually give you the compatibility from your version all the way up to the current. So compatibility levels, if that makes sense to you. So what it's going to show you, it's going to break out the breaking changes. So this will not work. Behavioral changes, which you need to be aware of, depreciated features, and informational items. And then it's going to talk about features or feature parity. So this is unsupported, it's partially supported, or just kind of high, medium, low. You should probably do this. And here's where I was saying that a new version of this tool just dropped and starts to do SSIS assessments. This is big because, again, as you're moving the database, the questions that always come up, and like I said, the gotchas are going to be around, well, what do I do to all these things that are connected to my relational database? And SSIS is one of those big ones. So the second part is migration. So assuming you get a clean assessment, or you get the assessment and you remediate, DMA can actually migrate your data. So same thing now, but for real, you're going to point it to the source, you're going to give it the target, you're going to give credentials on both sides this time, and now it's going to give you options. It's going to say, well, would you like to move the schema, the data, both, one, the other? So you can run this multiple times. You're going to get a non-impactful backup or non-breaking chain backup, and you can send this over. So you can run multiple tests. You can start to time out your migrations. You can do validation testing, and then you can blow it all away and do it over again. The only other thing it requires is storage accessible by both source and target. So you've got to be able to write a backup somewhere, and then the target has to be able to see that and pull it down. But it allows you to select the amount of DBs. So if you have multiple DBs, you can select just the ones you want to move. It's going to take a backup, as we said, and then restore that data with a pretty nice UI showing you where we're at and where it's going. And it will create the logins and connect or reconnect those orphan logins. So again, if you run this multiple times, it'll create the logins, and then it will know to reconnect those when it's done. So I'm going to flip over and show a couple demos. One is of the Database Migration Assistant assessment, and then one is an actual migration. So here I've created 3 assessments for 3 different platforms: a managed instance, a VM, so just run in 2017, and then the actual PaaS service. And just wanted to show you as we open this assessment, I'm not going to run the assessment, but it's not that difficult. This is where you start to get information about what is not supported. So I'm looking at feature parity, and this is SQL PaaS now. This is where it would say, hey, SQL PaaS won't support analysis services. It won't migrate that over. Now, there is a PaaS service we'll talk about, but essentially it's saying I can't just kind of lift the server and drop it in. Reporting services, very similar. I'm not able to just spin up reporting services on that machine. And then cross-reference database or cross-database queries. It actually gives you, and I just wanted to highlight this one, it kind of goes deep on what you need to do. And a couple searches, Google searches, you can start to see, okay, I can understand how I would remediate this, how I need to either use a different functionality in the PaaS world, or how I might have to maybe limit or kind of pull some things out that are no longer supported. So you get these feature parity issues, and then you can come over and you also get a compatibility issue area. Now, this SQL server happens to be running at compatibility level 100. So again, at 100, you're good to go. At 110, you start to see these same things. Full text search has changed. and that's going to carry forward all the way. So many times you'll see it's the same change that might have been introduced in a later version that now comes all the way through. So again, how many migration blockers do I have? 0. Behavioral changes. You're going to get a deeper dive. What do I need to do? There's no suggested fix here other than, you're going to have to kind of maybe pull that out or not rely on it. But it is going to show you impacted objects here. So that's a pretty nice feature. You can kind of know exactly what tables or stored procedures you need to look at. So again, we talked about this one being pure paths. So wanted to go through and then show you the managed instance one. So I'm going to open that assessment. Again, this was the same source, different targets. And here you see that feature parity, now the managed instance does support those areas we talked about. You can run those things. But there's one area, as we discussed earlier, PowerShell is not supported. And so you can go down to a specific job step and say, okay, what do I need to do? Here's the, I would erase that PowerShell command in there. So really nice kind of actionable intelligence. Again, some of these things, because you are moving to about the same version of SQL, whether it's managed instance or not, you're going to see the exact same compatibility warnings that full text search has changed. And then the last one I'll look at is just an IaaS deployment. So this is an actual, I just want to do SQL to SQL. And in our case, we're going to say SQL 2017. So I go ahead and open that assessment. And what you see here for feature recommendations is nothing that has to be remediated, and actually just some medium value things you should be thinking about. In this case, both encryption things, kind of encrypted always and encrypted in flight. So there's also some storage areas. So now these are kind of, hey, you may want to use this in your newer versions of SQL because it's supported. But essentially, you're looking at a pretty, I'll go back to compatibility issues as well, a pretty clean bill of health. And so assuming that I am good with this, or some of the warnings are acceptable, what you'd then do is you would schedule a migration. And so what I've done is I've said, okay, well, we're going to take a SQL 2008 R2 box and move it to an IaaS 20. In our case, I'm actually running 2019, but you'll see that it works in Azure. So other than running in Azure and getting kind of all the goodness of that OpEx and CapEx and infinite scale, it's a Windows 2016 box running SQL 2019. And so I've just given it, the source and the target. I've used SQL Server authentication, but you could use Windows authentication if you needed to. Active Directory, they're starting to move into even AAD type stuff. Put the password in, allowed for encryption, which is a nice security feature. And as we noted earlier, the only thing you really need to do here is have storage that is shared, that can be accessed by both. So we're going to go ahead and drop in that storage that can be accessible by both target and source. Pull that in. Now it's going to be doing the login at this point. It finds the logins that are on the SQL server. We're going to say, yes, I'd like to move that. Even though if you see this, I've already done this demo, the login exists. So what it's going to try to do, if it already exists, is it won't recreate it. It won't double it up. It'll just kind of fix the orphaned. And then you're going to hit start migration. So I don't know if you saw on the other page, but there was only one database. So in this case, it's just going to move the one database and the one login. And this will go pretty quickly, but you can see it's going to show you that a backup's in progress. And if you have multiple databases, I think the default is 8 databases that it'll be doing at the same time. So again, just make sure that it can handle that. That's both SQL Server and your storage can. Does the backup, does the restore, and then would create and marry the logins kind of together to that database, and then gives you the output. So at this point, you can export the report, and I've got kind of like a sample report here. gives you a nice congratulations. I think that's nice of them, but shows you a little bit of like what went on, what did I move. There's no orphaned users, none of the server roles. So you get that output, and obviously for bigger, more complex jobs, this would be a lot bigger. But that's really it. So again, non-impactful. So you can run this as many times as you need to. In this scenario, all I've been doing is deleting that database and kind of bringing it back and bringing it back. So at this point, if you had a test server out there, you'd be discussing it with your application teams. Go ahead and test. You could do things like network connectivity and all of the kind of ancillary things to an actual database move that needs to get done. So this would kind of be a big step, but just a step in the process to get your data moved over and all the ancillary parts. So flipping back to the presentation, I'm going to kind of just go through. I've got those just in case we need to, and we can pass those along just so you can follow along in the presentation if you don't have the webinar. But let's talk a little bit about the gotchas. So again, DMA moves the databases and logins, which to me is unbelievable. It's awesome. It works. But it only moves the databases and logins. So what else do I need to move when you're thinking about moving SQL services? So analysis services is a big one. Now there's a fully managed PaaS service that you can start to move that. You're going to have the same kind of PaaS kind of conversation, customization versus configuration, and that might involve an upgrade into itself. But there is a service that's available. For SSIS, we showed that you do have options kind of with managed instance or IaaS, but there is some of the more next gen, you might say, areas of machine learning, AI, data factory type of things. So Microsoft has this concept of the data factory out there, might be looking at doing a transformation there or just kind of lift and shift. So options there though. SSRS obviously has a Power BI opportunity. SQL jobs, many times it's pretty easy to just kind of right click and script all of those and move those over where it's available. But the one other thing I'd say for some of these is it is an option depending on kind of your use case to leave the old server up. So say you had a server that had the database and SSAS, ISRS, you can connect those, presuming other things were needed, and you could kind of have a different name of a SQL server in the Azure world and just point those at each other. So the option exists if you just wanted to move your data and worry about these things later, you could. Some of the things kind of outside the actual moves, a big one is application vendor support. So again, you'd have to, especially if this is a monolithic SQL server running a big application, make sure that the vendor supports the implementation you're running. In many ways, it's tough. This is a very new concept. So that managed instance, sometimes they'll say, yeah, we don't support PaaS. And when you say, well, do you support managed instance? It's like, well, you know, as long as I can get on the box and kind of run my queries, my performance analyzer, stuff like that, I don't really know how it's running. I don't care how it's running. Other vendors will say, no, it's not on the approved list, and you really need to go IaaS. So just be aware and be very kind of intentional about asking them about the different flavors of PaaS and about the deployment methods. You need to watch out about max database sizes. So again, if you get into some of these areas, the different sections that you select have different options that are available. So 8 terabytes, even at the small end, is fairly big, but if you go over that, you may be pushing yourself into PaaS, managed instance, or IaaS. Linked servers is obviously a big one when you're bringing that over. A lot of times, linked servers need to be cleaned up and addressed. And then database mail. So again, in the managed instance, database mail is available with some setup, but you need to be thinking about that. Are you sending those things out, and is there an alternative to that in the PaaS world? So kind of actionable next steps for your organization. So, when we talk cloud, and this is more in just general, the organizations that are really kind of knocking down our door, there's a kind of a driver for that. And typically those drivers around hardware refreshes, especially large core infrastructure. My SAN's coming up for renewal, or it's running out of size. Maybe a large core, network core needs to be refreshed. And organizations have been thinking about cloud, but are now kind of trying to build that roadmap out. Database capacity needs, same thing. I'm about to do a major database upgrade or throw more kind of hardware and storage at the problem. Maybe there's a cloud alternative. Building or data center renewals, depending on where your servers are located today, you might be thinking about getting out of a lease or getting out of the DR facility or service. OS and application support challenges, again, just not able to keep up, and you want to kind of push that pain over to Microsoft and let them take care of these things. That's typically a driver. And then cost and consolidation. So again, if I have many small SQL servers and I'm looking to consolidate, I think we would be remiss if we didn't say, well, have you thought about consolidating in cloud and maybe, taking some of the burden off your staff? And then again, from your data services team, your BI team, or whatever they're titled, do they have new functionality requests? Again, this goes back to if there's a major data initiative, can we be looking at those cloud things to maybe build the latest and greatest? And there's actually some functionality if you get into those AI and machine learning things that really aren't available within a colo data center. So that's where I'd be looking for a cloud solution anyway. So again, short-term drivers, and then think about what you guys want to learn or own long-term. So again, this doesn't have to be a huge, really deep exercise, but I would write down kind of 1, 3, 5-year visions and take an hour or two to think about where, as an organization, you think you're going to be. Where is an infrastructure team? Where is a data team? Where are you guys going to be in 5 years, 3 years, 1, and maybe work your way backwards. Also look at what gaps cloud would address right away. Sometimes because Microsoft makes it very easy through calculators to see costs, and data center costs can be very kind of opaque. You see that cost, there's kind of a sticker shock. But again, if you're not running in HA, if you're not running, in 2 different data centers, if you're not, comfortable with where your backups or your retention policy is, you're getting a lot of goodness in the cloud that maybe it's not an apples to apples comparison to your data center. And then specific to SQL, what I would do right away, download the tool, run against, the SQL servers that cause you the most pain or that are in the most, need of potential migration, running that tool to ensure where you are from a compatibility standpoint. You do not want to have to do all of this kind of, at the barrel of a gun. One of the things that's very easy or easier, I will say, is if compatibility levels are not where they need to be for newer versions, doing an inline compatibility upgrade. It's very easy to run SQL 2008 R2 compatibility levels on newer versions. Now, at some point, you're going to flip over, but one thing to take note, if you do a manual migration or a DMA tool migration and the compatibility level of a database needs to flip, it will flip automatically for you. And so if you haven't tested those things, you will run into, you could run into some issues, which is why it's a lot easier to kind of upgrade the compatibility level in place and then move over without needing that compatibility level change. Investigate your vendor support of your major databases and explore SaaS options. Again, if they have a product that all the way up to the application level does what you need it to do, rather than supporting that yourself on-prem, you might be able to do that just with a subscription. There's a lot of organizations and applications that are moving to that model. There's a lot of goodness in it, and again, at scale, they can manage and maintain those applications better than you can as a one-off. Explore your public cloud network options. So again, most organizations are going to create a site-to-site VPN and kind of have that test link, if you will. Doesn't have to be called test, but when you look at more enterprise options, especially for SQL, large SQL data streams, large enterprise transactional data feeds, creating direct connections, 2 connections versus 1 is where organizations start to go. It makes the pipe bigger, it gives you guaranteed quality of service, and it's more resilient. Determine your business-driven BCR gaps and do that analysis. So again, this is where I say, if you were looking to figure out how you were going to get a DR story or an HA, high availability story, retention and replication out, perhaps rather than buying a tool and kind of doing it yourself, you'll look at what are my alternatives in Azure. You also can make a case that you might run the SQL in on-premise facility, but then just replicate out to Azure as the first step. So there's definitely a lot of options there. If BCDR is a concern, certainly feel free to engage EGroup to talk about some of those things at a deeper level. And then I would say just really having that rough budget option. So again, if you want to see what IaaS, what on-prem, what PaaS at different levels is going to cost you, I think this really helps to fast track the conversations. So again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. So as you're talking about all these different options, it really helps to have some pricing available to understand if I am going to move to cloud, I get a lot of this goodness. You may have to pay a price for that goodness. So it's important to kind of have those and make the best choice that's right for your organization. And then, assuming somebody does come in and say, hey, we need that SQL moved, make sure that you're developing a plan for your other applications. What are you doing with SSIS, with AS, with RS? Do you have an opportunity to start to refactor those applications into cloud solutions? Or do you feel like, hey, it's not really transactional data, so I can move the underlying data, but still point those at my databases, no matter whether they're one rack over or now hundreds of miles away in a public cloud over a site to site. So those are kind of the SQL specific things I'd say. Each one of those I think is all 3 of those slides really is critical to have those conversations with the CFOs of your organization, the folks that are thinking about, hey, I've got all these legacy costs, maybe talking to your financial folks, your CFO about, do they prefer a CapEx or an OpEx model? Those are big things that really help talk through next steps for your organization. And then again, what's the right decision for me? And I've got this quote, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I think that's a great, way to leave this. There are some areas, there's flow charts that we could even provide you of like, if this, then that type of decisions. But really, it would take a deeper dive to talk about your current state, your administration costs, kind of what it costs you to take care of all those levels, your team's capabilities. Is there vendor support for some of these newer versions? What you'd like to do, what you have in place around BCDR, your sizes and the functionality required. Like each one of those things could lead us down a path. So if you're thinking about how do I embrace this cloud? I want to get there, but I'm not exactly sure. There's no kind of one size fits all, but we'd certainly go through this checklist, talk about the where you're trying to get, again, that 1, 3, and 5 year roadmap, and then try to come up with a solution that fits your organization best. And so with that, I'll leave it open for questions. Carly, I don't know if there were any that came in.
We do have a couple here. The first one is, when does support end for Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server 2008?
Gotcha. So SQL Server 2008 R2, actually, the support ended July 9th, so a month or so ago. So that is, you can get extended support, but that's a big one. Windows Server, which is probably a bigger issue to a lot of organizations, ends January 14th of 2020. So right around the corner in terms of infrastructure projects. One thing Microsoft has deployed to incent is if you move those servers kind of wholesale over to Azure, you do get free support of those services. So that's something that might kind of weigh into your decision about how fast to move. If you're looking for paying that money to extend support anyway, potentially getting those things moved to Azure as a good first step might be worth exploring. Good question, though.
All right, and then we have another one here that says, do you have to migrate all of a server's databases at the same time?
Okay, yeah, no, you don't. So you can pick and choose which ones you're going to move, logins as well. And as I kind of made reference to, you can do that multiple times. With the database, you just have to kind of blow it up and do the migration again. But logins can stay around, and then they'll just reattach any of those orphaned logins.
All right, and we had another question come in. How would you migrate SSIS jobs and linked servers requirement?
Gotcha. So SSIS, I'm looking forward to doing that analysis, kind of running through that analysis tool, because most SSIS jobs are not ready. So those typically are not cookie cutter. So for organizations, you'll definitely want to assess those pretty quickly. In the managed service world, you do have that engine, so you can kind of migrate those over. IaaS obviously would have the ability to do that as well. But that's where the Microsoft's kind of born in the cloud services like a data factory to ingest data, to move that data around, might be a better long-term option for you. Again, there's just some some supportability, some scalability stuff that those will offer. From a linked server perspective, and it was kind of on one of the slides, but there is an ability through, I believe it's called Elastic Query, to do similar things. But as far as the security model, again, if you think about the configuration, not customization, when Microsoft's trying to build these up, that ability to do a linked server, just because of the security implications and stuff like that, it's moving away from that. So it essentially is put some security boundaries that linked servers break, and you'd have to migrate those over, kind of find where you're using those linked servers, and then unwind those transactions in some way.
All right, and then we have one last question. Can DMA assess and migrate a SQL server in AWS?
Yes, it can. So the assessment tool actually, I think, just uses port 1433. So if you have access to SQL and the credentials, you could download that to a laptop and point it at a SQL server and give it the credentials. It will do that assessment, whether it's in Azure, whether it's in AWS, whether it's on-prem, if that port is exposed. Then to do the migration, kind of same thing. The only thing that gets a little bit trickier is just the shared storage conversation. So how you'd make that storage available to both sides of that, again, it's going to take a backup, and then that backup might happen in AWS, but the server that has to reach into get that backup would be in Azure. So just some site-to-site implications, or kind of figuring out where you'd put that shared storage.
Alrighty, I think that's all the questions that we received today. So thanks, Matt, and thanks again to everyone in attendance for taking the time out of your day to join us and for your participation. In case you missed anything or joined late, we will be sending out a link to the full recording of today's presentation. Also, our full lineup of recordings from our summer webinar series can be found on our EGroup YouTube channel. So yeah, thanks again for everyone for joining us, and have a fantastic week.
Thanks, Carly.